this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
General Montgomery was a complex figure, and his legacy remains a subject of debate amongst historians. In this episode, I'm joined by Andrew Harrison, the author of Caen, Cobra and Confusion, to examine the controversies surrounding Monty's leadership during the Normandy campaign. Central to our conversation are the misunderstandings about Monty's intentions for Caen and the American breakout at Operation Cobra, misconceptions that have played a significant role in shaping his legacy. We'll explore how events beyond the battlefield, as well as the perspectives of modern historians, have influenced how Monty's decisions are viewed today. Welcome, Andrew. So let's start with historical background. Montgomery, when he's appointed head of the 21st Army Group, which is the head of the British and Canadian forces, he's chief of the Allied ground forces for the duration of the Normandy campaign. But what's interesting is Churchill needed convincing. It's interesting there's some dissent. Why is Churchill dissenting from Monty's appointment?
It goes back to the time when Monty was appointed as head of 8th Army. You've got to remember that Churchill wanted to appoint Gott, and Gott was sort of, there's a rabbit hole for it to disappear down to. Gott was shot down on his way to Alexandria, I think it was, in an airplane. And Alan Brooke was very pro Monty from the get-go, because they'd had dealings when they were served together in the 3rd Division in France. So I think Alan Brooke had more faith in Monty than Churchill did. I think Churchill thought he was foisted on by fate, took a hand, and I think Churchill saw his strengths, but he had been having a bit of a pouty sort of like situation. He wanted who he wanted, sort of thing. You've got to remember that also they'd had dealings before when Monty was in Southern Command back in the UK, and he wasn't one to be pushed around. In truth, there wasn't much pushing around to be done, because once 1940 had calmed down, the Germans weren't coming for us, but nobody really knew that. But they had to keep the pot boiling, didn't they? But I think that Churchill recognised that Monty wasn't going to be the sort of person he could easily push around, and so it came to pass.
You mentioned fate there. It had never occurred to me, the choice of Monty and fate, because he comes obviously out of North Africa, and Sicily has been Britain's fighting general. So in some respects, fate plays a hand in who you can select. It has an unusual gravitas to it that might not otherwise have done if you were looking at a clean sweep of generals with no. We had no fighting general of such stature. I mean, Alex is obviously was above him in those campaigns, but again, he's not necessarily the fighting general, is he?
Well, they are cruel, I suppose. When he says, as long as Alex did what he was told, I did the fighting and I won Alex's battles, sort of thing. That's basically Monty's view of things, But I think Alex wouldn't have been a bad choice for commander of Overlord. I think he would have been pushed around by the stronger personalities. It was very much if he could accommodate someone, he would, and sometimes that was to the detriment of the wider campaigns he's in charge of. And it's strange you say fate as well. I think that if Monty did very well in North Africa, of course. He's remembered of the hero of victory at El Alamein, but he didn't do that well in Italy. If he'd have been sidelined, Alex took over and Monty was left in Italy, I think a lot of the lustre would have been taken off his achievements.
Let's look at his approach to planning, because that's perhaps in this build-up to Normandy, and we're going to be perhaps the crux of this will be looking at Caen eventually. But how does Monty approach planning, his Normandy campaign?
Well, I suppose these days you'd think of Monty as being quite forward-thinking. He said a thing, I read no paper. And he didn't either. He wasn't joking. He did read something, obviously. He didn't leave it all to Freddie, his chief of staff. But he set forth the general gist of the things, and then he let the various staffs get on with it, essentially. And then he'd review it, much like he did with Cossack. He read the paper, didn't like it, said it was no good, and then went off and told Churchill that.
Cossack was the initial plan for Normandy invasion.
For Normandy. But we've got to bear in mind that when General Morgan was given the job, he wasn't given very much power to do it with. Alan Brooks said, won't work, but you've got to bloody well make it work. To his credit, Morgan knew that the forces he was assigned on paper weren't enough for the job. He knew that a three-division landing wasn't going to be wide enough. He had one airborne division, I think it was, and he knew that it wasn't going to work. But if it wasn't for Morgan's legwork, then I don't think that Monty and Monty's staff would have had a hope in hell from January 1944 to the actual launch of D-Day itself. A lot of the legwork had been done. They'd chosen the landing areas. They'd ruled out other things. Yeah, Monty wanted to do another landing on the other side of St. Malo when he was talked out of that. But a lot of the legwork had already been done by Morgan. His way of doing things was telling X, Y, and Z that what he wanted and leaving X, Y, and Z to get on with it. He left a lot, I think, to Freddie de Guingans to sort out. And then he would either yay or nay.
But he was the arch planner. He did have plans in place. He wasn't as if he sort of hand-waved things and made things up. He had reasons for what he was doing, things that he'd pre-thought out beforehand.
He did, but he was thinking based on what other people had written. He knew full well that he couldn't start again from scratch. There was no time, and he also got to bear in mind there's a timeline as well outside of Monty's control that the Americans they'd committed to the Germany first policy, but there was always that in the background. Would the Americans get tired of fighting the Germans? Because you bear in mind, it wasn't until quite late in the war that the Americans they didn't really have any animus really to the Germans. There's a lot of German people of German background in the United States. So it wasn't really a major thing. Luckily for the Allies, Roosevelt had the conviction that if you didn't defeat the Germans first, then it would be a lot harder to get rid of them after you beat the Japanese sort of thing. So he stuck to that, despite a lot of people like Admiral King and what I wanted to say, we've got to beat the Japanese first. So, but I think that was that timeline in the background. They didn't have time. And he also had Stalin as well, Karping as well in the background, saying, we're doing all the fighting. For whatever else he was, nobody could accuse Monty of not being pragmatic. He wasn't afraid to use other people's ideas. It's sometimes those ideas that got used weren't always credited. He really hopeless in academia. He'd have been drummed out for plagiarism.
In Monty's plan, he has Caen to be captured on the first day of the campaign. Now, it's 9 miles from Sword Beach, which in some respects doesn't seem very far, but in other respects you think, well, you've got to land on the beach and get 9 miles inland. And he reiterates that that's the objective in Thunderclap, which is the exercise where they're planning the landings. Why focus on Caen? Is there a symbolism? What is there a strategic necessity to the city?
For start off, it's the major road hub in Normandy. It separates the Americans from the British side of things. So if you lose Caen, then you'll be able to swap troops and reinforcements from the west to the east reasonably easily. Now, even though it hadn't been taken, you've got to make darn sure that it isn't taken, and that's why it was such an important point. I don't think, really, in his heart of hearts, Monty thought it would be taken. If it had fallen, then happy days, he'd have taken the kudos. But I don't think in his heart of hearts he really thought. But bear in mind as well that Sword is the smallest of the 5 landing beaches. It could only take one brigade at a time. It could only land one. By the time that the follow-up brigade landed on Sword, they were way behind schedule anyway. But the amount of troops and tanks that got onto Sword and off Sword, past Hillman and Morris, the 2 strong points that did most of the holding up of the troops, the push on Caen was pathetically short-handed. You're basically one battalion up, 2 battalions either side. It was done with little more than a company-sized push, even though they had the people riding on the backs of tanks, Soviet style. It just didn't have a hope in hell of getting to. But if you bear in mind, though, that when Monty gave his orders to Second Army, Second British Army, that is, and First Corps in turn passed the orders to Third British Division, what First Corps said is that by the evening of D-Day, Caen had got to be taken or effectively masked. And it was effectively masked.
Well, when was that order given or in the planning?
That came out in April of 1944. So the tasking was always to be take Caen on D-Day. That has its roots in Anzio. It's not enough to get onto the beach. You've got to get off the beach and inland. I can't give you the reference number, but there's a thing in the National Archives of Monty sends the layout of the initial plan for Overlord, and it comes back with the 1940s edition of a post-it note from Winston saying if only they'd have put more emphasis on getting off the beach at Anzio, because everyone knows what happened at Anzio. The American general consolidated, let's call it like that. The Germans piled in, and it was touch and go for a while whether or not the beach would have to be evacuated. That goes back to the Germany First thing. It was a statement of intent rather than an expectation. I think you had to get onto the beach. You had to get off the beach. Whether or not you're going to get 9 miles to Caen is another thing. But I think that was basically what Monty wanted to drill into people's heads. It wasn't enough to get onto the beaches. You had to get off those beaches. And he said he had to brigade forces had to go inland and peg out claims well inland to allow follow-on forces. Well, that's what happened, and it just so happened that they were pretty much, let's call it, bottled up. They were and they weren't. But I also think as well that was maybe a blessing in disguise, because let's face it, British and American armour weren't the greatest in the world. If you'd have got broken into tank country proper, they'd still have won, but they've lost an awful lot more tanks in the process because they just weren't very good.
That's an interesting point. I think the Anzio point's excellent justification. When I talked to Steve Fisher about Sword, I said to him, "Why Caen?" He said, "Well, you've got to aim for somewhere." And I thought, well, that's that's fair enough. You've got to go in some direction. So if you put your flag in there, and again, thinking back, you certainly from Monty's point of view, you think back to the First World War. You have to have an objective. That's almost beyond reach, because you don't want people to get to the objective and stop.
I think there's a recognition as well that they were lucky in Sicily. Sicily wasn't really defended terribly well, it has to be said, and that was a steep learning curve in itself. The way that the airborne forces were utilised. Gliders went off course, people were drowned in their gliders. So it was all a very steep learning curve. And Italy, in turn, was a learning curve, even though Winston would have liked to have gone through Italy into the soft gut, some gut, as some people said. I think everyone recognised that it was a very, very steep learning curve. Sicily, let's call it easy. Italy, easier, apart from Anzio, but geography was against them as much as the enemy. I think they knew that in their heart of hearts, they only had one crack at this. The reason that Ike wrote that, it was all my fault, and the failure last is on me. If you think about it, if D-Day had failed, which I don't think it really stood a chance unless we really did, screw up. But if it had failed, that would have been the end of Germany first. And goodness knows what Stalin would have made of the opportunity given to him for all his carping. If you think about it, and again, sorry, going off on a tangent, the Russians didn't really fight the war strictly strategically. Had they done so, they'd have been in Berlin by end of 1944, but they diverted. They snapped up eastern countries, Romania, Hungary. They wouldn't have got tied up with the Carpathians. They'd have just gone straight for Berlin, and that'd be game over. And maybe even they'd have finished at the Channel. You'd never know.
Oh, except for finish in Paris, yeah. But what's interesting, we're pointing out, that they were aware in the planning that Sword was going to be the smallest beach to get men ashore. So even at Thunderclap, did it look reasonable to get to Caen, or do we really honestly think it was just kind of hyperbole on Monty's part in the plan? Was Caen?
I think he thought there was an outside chance. In reality, my interpretation of Thunderclap and Thunderclap presentations is that he thought there was an outside chance of getting to Caen. Whether or not they'd have been able to stay in Caen, that's another matter. I think they'd have been beaten back, personally. They wouldn't have been chucked back into the sea. If they'd have got to Caen, they'd probably got as far as Caen-Carpiquet, the airfield there, and dug in there, maybe. As I say, I think he thought it was an outside chance. But if you remember as well, Eisenhower, and let's face it, even though unity was much trumpeted, and they were fairly unified up until, the start of D-Day. The carping didn't really start until they got ashore and were seemingly stuck. Eisenhower did say, "I see it as the duty of every person here. If you see a flaw in this plan, then for goodness sake, speak up." He didn't say in those words, I'm paraphrasing. But, if you see anything that needs to be said, this is the time to say it. You're amongst friends, so to speak. And no one said a thing. And it's not as if Monty didn't have for all the need for unity. It's not as if Monty didn't have enough, he hadn't ruffled enough feathers in days gone by for someone to say, yeah, well that stinks. That's Sword's only one brigade in size. And you've got to bear in mind, so small was Sword. It was the first beach to be closed down as well. And it came under fire from places like Le Havre as well, because it was close enough to other main German fortresses. So it wasn't the easiest beach in the world. It certainly wasn't the Utah, and that's not knocking the Americans in Utah. Logistically, it was probably the worst beach of the five.
When they failed to take Caen, you have this. I'm not sure if there's a Monty idiom or not, but you get this idea that the British start fighting, and the British and the Canadians sort of act as this anvil where the Germans are throwing themselves against. I'm not sure if actually Monty used that anvil analogy or not, or where it comes from. I wonder, is this what happened, or was this planned?
It depends who you speak to and who you.
What do the sources say from the time?
Interestingly, the Canadian General Krier, he was always of the opinion that Caen was going to be the anvil, the thing that the Germans would the wall that the Germans were going to smash themselves against, while the Americans built themselves up to break through and eventually break out. The Canadians thought that. Alan Brooks certainly thought that. Monty thought that, but he never really spelt it out. This "I read no paper" business counts against him. In the ideal world, what should have happened, in my opinion, is that Monty should have come clean by about D plus 3 or 4. They look, we're not going to get to Caen. If he'd have just taken Eisenhower, and he probably would never have convinced Tedder. Absolutely, Tedder, I think, would still have been his major thorn in his side. But at least he would have been able to draw some of the poison that was directed at him. There's an interesting thing that one of his staff officers said, that he always had to project immense confidence. It's no good for someone to say, well, we got a shore, yeah, but we're up against it a bit here, so we'll do our best, and then blah blah blah. People would have thought, well, blimey, if the bloke who drew up the plan thinks it's not going so well, then let's get Alexander primed, or let's get someone else primed for the job. And I don't think Monty ever had any doubt in his mind that by D plus 90 they'd be where they needed to be. In fact, they were. Again, jumping the gun slightly. I don't think he ever thought that they would fail. But people conflated ground taken with success, and that was never Monty's idea. If he'd have only taken Eisenhower into his confidence and said, look, we wanted to get to Caen, we haven't got to Caen, but it is massed. It is effectively massed. You bear in mind again that even at that early stage, yes, the 21st Panzer Division got to between Juno and Sword on D-Day, but that's the furthest they got. When they saw the gliders and the airborne reinforcements coming in on the evening of D-Day, they panicked and withdrew, and that was they never got further than that again. I just think basically it was Monty being Monty. He knew it was going to plan. There's a good thing before it came to Thunderclap that he said basically British Canadians will take their orders from me. American doctrine will be their own affair. No bellyaching. I don't think he liked bellyaching. So if Monty was confident, then everyone else should be confident.
Well, I do wonder if the whole narrative of this anvil, attritional battle reflects the situation at the time. But the problem Monty has is you can't admit to the world that your plan isn't quite going to what it should be going to, because it's awful PR. So he kind of reinvents what the PR is at the time, but then he never deviates away from that in the post-war world to even hint that it wasn't quite going to plan, and sticks to it absolutely adamantly. And that's possibly where this sort of problem comes when you're looking at it afterwards with hindsight.
I don't believe for 1 minute that Monty wasn't aware of the First Corps order to Third Army, because he may not have read paper, but Freddie did. Freddie de Guinga, Chief of Staff. I don't believe for one split second that would have escaped Freddie's attention. It's a big thing. If you are told you will take Caen to Second Army, if you tell Second Army, and then Second Army tells First Corps, and then First Corps tells Third Army, they've given them some wriggle room there. You've got to get there, but if you don't get there, make sure that they can't take advantage of holding it. And that's exactly what happened. I would pick pounds to pence that Monty was aware of that. He may not have read it, but I think he used that flexibility to his advantage. The trouble is, he overplayed his hand, being Monty. You've got to bear in mind, Monty could not read a room to save his life. I wouldn't want anyone to think that my work is unquestioningly 100% pro Monty. You'd lock him in an empty room and he'd cause a punch-up. He just had that skill. It's a gift for Monty, rather than tell people what people knew, but would rather have confirmed. And no, it's all going swimmingly. It's going great. And if you didn't like Monty in the first place, well, he's a bloody idiot, that bloke. It's just, I always thought it would go wrong.
Well, and as I say, he doesn't help his legacy by never admitting to it. Once he's got a direction of travel, he sticks to it through thick and thin with his narrative.
It could change his mind. I mean, he was talked out of the extra landing beach prior to the presentation for Thunderclap. He wanted to land the other side of San Malo. If you think back to his Al Alamein days, his initial plan didn't work as he expected, so he rewrote it. Was it
Supercharge?
Supercharge, yeah. That was sort of like addendum to the original plan that he came up with. So he could change his mind on the hoof. It's just that he'd rather not have done. He wouldn't be bullied into doing something he didn't think was absolutely right. I think he'd have had to been relieved before, that sort of thing would have happened. How
do you view Operation Epsom then? I always sort of thought that Epsom was Monty attempted to be a bit of a thruster and wanted to do a breakout, but it can also be viewed as part of Monty's Anvil strategy, where it's just there to trick the German forces, of which there is a lot in Caen, as you pointed out. It's the logistical hub, all roads lead to Caen. So there was always going to be strong opposition, and Epsom stalls. So again, is Epsom a breakout battle, or was it intended to be an attritional battle? My heart bleeds for people who took part in Epsom. It could have been. It came so close to being what it should have been. It came so close. I mean, everyone remembers Epsom, as Villers-Bocage and Whitman coming in and thrashing 7th Armoured. I don't want anyone thinking that I'm blaming individual units. We weren't there. But I think 7th Armoured were probably the worst people to choose. I don't think really they should have been chosen for Normandy anyway. They were worn out. They were chosen because they were seen as a backbone. Other units could coalesce around their experience. You really didn't want to be one of Monty's favourite units, because you got dragged rounded from North Africa to Sicily, and you'd probably already been in the BAF. Exactly. They were knackered. There's no two ways about it. There was a core backbone of veterans from those days, but they'd done their bit as far as they said. And this wasn't just 7th Armoured. Most units say this, American, Canadian, British, like the training they got given, whilst it was useful to form the units into solid coalesced units, it wasn't in any way, shape or form really suitable for Normandy. And the 7th Armoured, I think they did most of their practice in Norfolk, in the Norfolk area, East Anglia. So, Bocage and that sort of thing. Couldn't. It's like practicing mountain warfare in Norfolk. There's not many mountains. No hedges. Again, 7th Armoured, they were given or they were assigned a dedicated reconnaissance unit as well, which they could have used properly, but they didn't. So they pushed on to the other side of Villers. They got as far as, I can't remember the hill number outside of Villers. They got there, they got assigned there. Whitman came in, blasted the leading elements to bits. That wasn't the game changer in itself. It just didn't work. There wasn't enough urgency put into it. I think it was a learning curve for the Allies as well. I mean, you go to Villers-Bocage, when was that? That was like the 12th of June sort of thing. It's 6 days after the landings themselves, when the chap in charge of 7th Armoured pulled them out. They didn't get back to Villers again until midway through August. That was a high point and a low point for them. But what it did do, even though it did support the Americans, they were on the flank of Villers and of the Epsom area, it did stop all the reinforcements. It diverted the Panzer reinforcements onto Monty's blokes instead of being sent down to the Americans. So it did its job, but it just didn't do its job as per the plan. I don't think it's ever considered to be a breakout per se, but it should have been to give more ground for following units to spread out in. And had it have worked, then Goodwood probably would have been a lot better, in the following month
because you got to bear in mind, and again, I'm jumping the gun slightly here. One of Goodwood's issues was there wasn't supposed to be a 3-division attack in a trident formation, but it wasn't because there just wasn't enough room. They were essentially breaking out of the area that 6th Airborne had captured on D-Day. It was a very, very, very crowded bridgehead. And had Epsom succeeded, then Goodwood wouldn't have been the failure it was perceived. I don't think it was a failure in itself. Monty's get out of jail free card, and I do believe at this point was he wasn't there to capture ground. He was there to crumble the enemy, to wear them down, and he did that as well. You know, Epsom.
But did he say that at the time?
Yeah, he said that frequently at the time. I'm not interested in capture of ground per se. One of the results of Epsom was that 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which, funnily enough, had been created specifically to repel the Allied invasion when it was coming, because the Germans knew they were coming. But 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were in that corps. They got sent off to Russia because they were always robbing Peter to pay Paul. So they were in Russia at the time of the landings. They were rushed back to Normandy in dribs and drabs, and rather than putting them into battle, not even in divisional strength, they were in dribs and drabs, in battalion and company strength. And so they got embroiled in the fighting to contain Epsom, and that worked from a Monty point of view. All the Germans were more concerned with going to the the 21st Army Group. You've got to bear in mind, the Americans didn't get as far as they anticipated because they were in any way, shape or form not up to the job. It's just they had the worst of the barrage as well. They only had like a division, just over a division's worth of panzers facing them. That didn't make any difference. I think 17th SS Panzer Grenadiers as well, but that's not a dedicated panzer unit. It's just that had they had more panzers there, their job would have been even worse. And everyone recognised this. Bradley recognised it. In fact, Bradley described the British-Canadian role as sacrificial. Everyone knew. And by everyone, I mean the people in Chafe, although they seemed to change their mind as the battle progressed. But everyone knew that essentially, just like Bradley said, that the British Canadians, they were going to take the worst of the beatings so the Americans could build up and break out. And that's exactly what happened. But perceptions changed over the course of the battle.
My view of Monty has always sort of been that he's very good at those set-piece battles, but what he is not, he doesn't necessarily excel at being fleet of foot when it comes to these thrusting sort of breakout operations. He's not necessarily quick. And I sort of always have lumped, possibly wrongly, Epsom and Goodwood into that sort of he not quite getting it right. But on the flip side, he's proved right because those operations forced the Germans to address the big British threat, which pulls the Germans down, which causes these attritional battles. And I was always feeling that Monty wanted to avoid attritional battles, partly again going back to his First World War experience of wanting to avoid attritional battles. And that's sort of accidentally what he finds himself fighting when he can't do these war of manoeuvre operations. I thought Operation Goodwood and Epsom were meant to be, even the name sort of hints at the fact that they're going to be charging out.
It didn't help himself. I don't know if we'll go into this later. He didn't help himself with the way he pitched things as well. Well,
let's get to his language. It's a fascinating his use of language and his intentions. And
exactly. I mean, and that's I think that's something that the Americans could sometimes be accused of being literally minded. Before Goodwood came about, I mean, there was the two auxiliary operations, one of which was called Operation Pomegranate. The other one was Operation Green Line, I think it was. So when he wrote to Eisenhower to say, this is what I've got planned, says before that, the front will burst into flames. And I don't think he meant that apocryphally, as if the flames would be aimed at Canadians and British. But I think he talked such a good talk. And I don't mean that as in he never expected things to come to pass. I think that he G'd up members of Chafe so much that they thought, well, this is it. This is going to be it. This is going to be it. This is going to be it. And the thing that really boggles me is that the plan always was, regardless of what Morgan said, the plan always was for the breakout to be on the American sector. It wasn't ever going to be on the British sector. But everyone put such high regard to Goodwood. This is going to be 3 divisions of armour. They're going to blast through, and then we're going to chase off to Paris that way. I mean, Paris wasn't even a Normandy objective anyway. until the French did their own thing and put it was fait accompli to the American forces. But people within SHAEF thought, well, this is it. We're going to be charging off via 21st Army. And what did they think that first US Army were going to be doing after that then? Oh, sorry, lads, you've wasted all that time there around Saint-Lô, so you can just mop up Brittany. The British and Canadians will take care of it for you. Can you imagine? That's just not ever going to happen, is it?
Goodwood was really the British did the Allies need to control Caen because that's such a logistical hub that you're trying to break out and find a way around to cut it off, presumably.
But Goodwood as well was supposed to be in conjunction with the Americans around Saint-Lô as well. So it was the Americans weren't ready of Saint-Lô, so they just went in. By the time of Goodwood, so Goodwood just went ahead without them, sort of thing, as a way of tying down extra units to the British and Canadians. There was a talk or a meeting between Monty, Bradley, and the chap in charge of Second British Army, highlighting what the next stage would be. And Bradley said to Monty, "We're just not ready." And Bradley and Monty said, "We'll just take all the time you need in the world. It's okay, Brad. You just do what you need to do. We'll do our thing and keep the Germans away from you." But that's he didn't say that exactly. But again, paraphrasing. Monty knew that the British Army was essentially a wasting asset, whatever he said. That's why Goodwood was so armour heavy compared to the infantry battalions. We had loads more armour than we did the infantry.
This again perhaps comes back to his First World War, where he's throwing in loads of 1917, which was his Western Front experience of planning battles. He's throw loads of artillery over and get your tanks in and don't penny packet them, make a big punch, which is not necessarily the lessons from late 1918, where he's not on the Western Front. We've moved on from that. So in some respects, he's fighting that classic First World War battle there. Attritional.
I think you're right. The ghosts the ghosts of Monty's experience in the First World War were with him constantly. You've got to bear in mind he was severely injured in the first weeks of the war. He got shot through the lung, didn't he, and dragged off the battlefield. I mean, it's been called Steel Not Flesh, hasn't it? Other people have named it differently. But I think that was a result of his First World War experiences. He didn't want to have all those telegrams ending back in England or Canada or even America. I mean, John Buckley wrote an excellent book, you're probably aware of it, called Monty's Men. And I honestly think that Monty's Men included the Americans as well. He didn't want to waste lives if he could possibly help it. That's why the Allies and Monty as well were such adherents to the steel not flesh concept. A ton of bombs would be used to save a dozen blokes' lives or 100 blokes' lives. I mean, you would never get away, let's face it, with talks of cricket and crimes against humanity. The idea of flattening Caen wasn't the idea behind Operation Charnwood and the bombing thing. No one really suffered from that, did they, reputationally speaking wise? Caen was absolutely flattened. There's no two ways about it. He did what he did, or what he asked for the support he did, which was willingly given and supported by the likes of Tedder and Eisenhower et al. But he did it to preserve the lives of Allied fighting soldiers. Yeah,
although then it's slightly counterintuitive when you then claim afterwards that you're fighting attritional battles on purpose, which I think comes back to almost rewriting the situation on the ground to fit the facts of the time. Does that make sense? I don't. This comes back. I don't necessarily think he intentionally fought massive attritional battles against the Germans. It was a PR spin at the time that he stuck with.
Again, it goes back to my point about, going back to D+3 or 4. If he'd have said to Eisenhower and Tedder and whoever, Bedell Smith, put a cricketing metaphor, we didn't get a boundary, we didn't knock it out, a boundary, we only got a 3 or a 4. Well, fair enough then, all right, Monty, let's just stick with the plan as is. I just wonder how it would have gone down, though. Can you imagine the conversation? Right, Ike, we didn't get to Caen. To be honest with you, I didn't really think we would, but it's okay because, we're going to just pull the Germans onto us. Once Caen was taken, again, the idea was always to pull the Germans against the British Canadians, but the Germans wouldn't have had Caen to congregate around. So the idea was always there.
This perhaps goes back to his personality, making it difficult for him to make those subsequent corrections, factually to people. Whereas Brad might have said it to Ike and he'd gone, fair enough, Brad, off we go. But Monty, he was so bombastic and caustic and rubbed people up the wrong way, it wouldn't necessarily be that it could be used against him.
I think other writers and historians also think about stuff that happened after Normandy as well. market garden being 90% successful, putting a positive spin on things, pulling out of Saint-Vith when he was put in charge of the Americans in the Bulge. Monty is a victim's probably the wrong word. I don't think Monty ever considered himself a victim. Probably victimised other people. So I am actually more pro Monty than anti-Monty, but I do recognise his bad points. I think that he was hoisted by his own petard for other things that happened after Normandy, so they just lumped it all in. He was rubbish at Normandy. He screwed up Market Garden. He gave away ground needlessly at Saint-Vith. And then he told everyone that if it wasn't for Bernard or Montgomery, the Americans would have gone screaming out of the Ardennes. He didn't exactly say that either, but his room reading skills, my goodness, they were terrible. And I think stuff that happened all through the war came back to haunt him, and it was just used as another thing. It wasn't that great in Normandy, blah 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 blah, and it all came. It was cumulative.
Folks, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. So, post-war, obviously post-war, more recently even, Max Hastings and Anthony Beauvoir have written big books on Normandy, and they're both being critical of him, aren't they? What are they pointing to? Because, interesting, they're both British authors. One might have thought that we were sympathetic to him.
Max Hastings is one of those authors where before you start to know a little bit about, I did a master's degree, and I'm not saying, my master's outranks Max Hastings or Anthony Beevor's knowledge to sketch, but that he has an audience. He has a target audience, Max Hastings does, and a lot of that audience is in North America. He knows who he's pitching at. Beevor, in his book about Normandy, Beevor cites, and to his credit, he does say he cites unconfirmed sources. Well, if they're unconfirmed, why mention them? I could say, I could write a book about, I don't know, the U-boat war, and I could say, unconfirmed sources said that the little green men from Mars had happened in the sinking of the Royal Oak. It's tosh. Max as well, he goes for this man-for-man business. Man-for-man, the Germans were more successful than the Allied equivalent soldiers. But you've got to bear in mind that is based on old research that took place just after the Second World War, which has since been largely disproved. Well, he writes some good stuff. I don't want to give the impression that I'm anti-Max Hastings. I'm not. But he's very Monty in his own way. He will not admit a mistake. I'm sure that probably drive him mad compared to Monty. And I think that Anthony Beevor's the same. And I think people like Stephen Ambrose are the same as well. Ambrose did a presentation to the White House Chief of Staff people, and it's also on C-SPAN as well. You can find it. Someone asked him a question about Monty, and he said, well, we all know what a prick Monty was. Maybe Monty was a bit on that side. There's no maybe about it, he was. But for a historian to say, that he was a so-and-so, and, that just justifies everything I say about him. It's not right. It's not right. It's not proper. It's not historical to say that. You could make the same argument for MacArthur. You could make the same argument for Patton, because they have their audience. It sticks. And because people who perhaps aren't as widely read as other people are, or know something about the campaign generally, they take what they see on paper or in documentaries or whatnot ever as gospel, because, hey, why would it be in a book, or why would it be on a documentary? And you've got to bear in mind as well that a lot of the people that, especially in the early days of the post-war, a lot of the people they were writing about were still alive. They were still in post. And, the greatest generation was still very much a thing in America. You can't say that, they made mistakes and expect to get away with it, because, it just wouldn't fly.
Well, this sometimes comes down to the problem of the public history. It's partly ends up being hand waving, and because people are not interested in detailed nuance, because it just gets muddy and affects the narrative of the story. So the historian tends to simplify things, but there again, at the same time, they don't want to be too iconoclastic, because then it upsets people, and then that doesn't sell books for different reasons. So you end up with a public history that gets stuck, and an academic history that pulls further and further away, and the public history becomes just less meaningful in its realities. I mean, you can certainly see that about the historiography of the First World War, that everybody feels the First World War, that Blackadder's some form of truthful documentary, and it was only ever written as sort of comedic satire. An academic history of the First World War is so far in advance of the public history, it becomes almost embarrassing. I wonder if this is a moment in time where you can see that happening with sort of Montgomery, when academic history is nuancing him rather than being this black and white figure.
I think it's interesting that Montgomery's moment in the sun from an outsider's point of view was quite short. The first widely read biography of him was very, very pro-Monty. But that was his apogee, mainly because Monty is, flinging mud at people. As you've said, you couldn't admit knocking the initial ball for four wasn't quite what they were after. They were after a boundary, but, he couldn't admit it even then. Monty was Monty. He was that way inclined. But I think there's two final things you've got to bear in mind about Monty. Monty knew he was a good trainer of men. He was an acknowledged trainer of men. And when he was between the wars, he was in charge of the Ridings Division, the West Riding Division, based in York. So that was a TA division, largely made up of TA soldiers. And I think this is what stood him in such good stead later on when he came to the Second World War. He realised that it was pointless because he only had them for a 2-week camp and evenings here and there. He realised that there was only so much you could do with a citizen army. I know that's an Ambrose phrase, but we'll use it here. There's only so much you could expect of a citizen army. So it was pointless trying to drill into them guards' regimental ways of doing square bashing. That wasn't going to really serve any use when it gets to the battlefield. And I think he developed the way of training men who didn't want to be necessarily soldiers, or at least they didn't see why they should be full-time soldiers, which is what the TA was. So he knew he could only get so much out of citizen soldiers. That's basically the point I'm making. In the way that the Germans didn't have that ability. You wouldn't have got 14-year-old people, 14-year-old lads, 15-year-old lads, 16-year-old lads. Was it 12th SS Hitlerjugend? Most of them were so young they couldn't even have their schnapps rations. They'd give them sweets and pop, or whatever, pass the pop. But they were totally indoctrinated. So I think he knew what he could get out of citizen soldiers. Remember what Horrocks said about in 10 men, you'd have one person being from the front, you'd have 3 people following along, and the others would do what they were told. And there'd be one bloke there who would give anything not to be there, sort of thing. That's what you had to bear in mind. There were exceptions to the rule. The paratroop divisions, they were very high motivated. But final thing about Monty, I can't remember the name of the chap now. Do you remember that I Was Monty's Double, the film?
Yes.
So the person who played him was stopped in the street one day in the 50s by a lady, and she said, "You mistook him? Are you General Montgomery?" "No, I'm so and so. I played in blah blah blah." They got talking, and before they parted, she told him that she had written to Montgomery, saying that my son served with your army. Didn't say which battle, and he was killed. But he always spoke highly of you, and he was very proud to be in the British Army. And every year from then on, she got a Christmas card from Monty. So I'm not saying everyone who wrote to Monty got a Christmas card, but for all his bombast, I think that tells you something. In his own way, I think Monty felt the loss of the people under his command, whether it be British, Canadian, French, or American. I think they were all basically Monty's men, and if he could do something to not have them lost, then he would do so. Maybe still not flesh is a thing of that. I know it's an American doctrine as well, but I think that tells you something about Monty the man. He didn't take his responsibilities lightly. People might not have liked him. People might have thought he was an absolute so and so. But I think he felt the weight of responsibility on him, but he just struggled to find a way of showing that.
Well, that seems like a fitting place to finish. Thank you, Andrew. Loyal listener, if you want to read more about Monty in Normandy and his command decisions and how they have been interpreted, the book is Caen, Cobra and Confusion. Whether you are a Monty acolyte or not, it is a thought-provoking read. Now, if you have enjoyed this episode, don't forget you can support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcasts. By becoming a patron, you'll gain access to ad-free episodes, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in every discussion. Plus, you'll unlock occasional exclusive bonus material, which might not have made it into the main podcast. So to sign up, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's it for this episode. Next time, we'll be looking at RAF mine-laying operations. Probably something you had never considered, but there's much more to it than I had thought. It's a really interesting topic. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.